I knew something was wrong the second I stepped into my backyard and saw sunlight coming through a place where sunlight wasn't supposed to be. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. I just stood there holding a half-empty coffee mug, staring at a section of my cedar fence that looked different. Then it hit me. Somebody had opened it. Not accidentally. Not because of wind. Not because of some loose hardware. Someone had physically unlatched one of my fence panels, folded it back, and propped it open with a landscaping stone. And sitting on the other side of that opening, like he owned the place, was my neighbor. That's the day I learned that some people will go to incredible lengths for something they think they're entitled to. And it's also the day I decided that if somebody wanted to treat my property like a public park, I was going to give them a lesson they'd never forget. 3 years earlier, I'd moved into a quiet neighborhood outside a small lakeside town called Ashton Ridge. It wasn't a wealthy community exactly, but it was one of those places where everybody took pride in their homes. Fresh mulch every spring, American flags on porches during the summer, Christmas lights that somehow stayed up until February. The kind of neighborhood where people wave when they drive by and somehow know the names of dogs before they know the names of owners. When I bought my house, the realtor pointed out something special about the property. My lot wasn't on the lake itself, but because of the way the houses were positioned, I had a direct view of the water from my backyard. Not a partial view, not a seasonal glimpse through tree branches. A clean sight line stretching all the way to the lake. Every evening, I'd sit outside after work and watch the sun reflect off the water. It wasn't the reason I bought the house, but it quickly became my favorite thing about living there. My neighbor, a guy named Brandon Mercer, noticed it too. Brandon lived next door with his wife, Melissa. They'd been in the neighborhood longer than anyone else on our street. The first few months after I moved in, Brandon was friendly enough. He'd wander over while I was mowing the lawn, lean against the fence line, and make small talk. At first, I appreciated it. Moving somewhere new can be lonely, and having a neighbor who seemed welcoming felt like a good sign. But after a while, I noticed something. Every conversation, somehow, circled back to the lake view. "Man, you've got the best angle in the whole neighborhood," he'd say. Or, "Funny how the developer laid these lots out. Yours gets all the scenery." Sometimes he'd stand in my yard while we talked and just stare at the water. I remember one evening he actually sighed and said, "I'd kill for this view." At the time I laughed because I assumed he was joking. Looking back, maybe he wasn't. About a year after moving in, I decided to install a 6-foot cedar privacy fence. Nothing dramatic. I worked from home. I wanted more privacy, and my golden retriever, Murphy, had developed a habit of investigating every squirrel within a 3-block radius. The fence solved all those problems. I hired a licensed contractor, got HOA approval, confirmed the property lines with a survey, and had everything installed completely by the book. When the project was finished, it looked great. The fence sat entirely on my property, exactly where it was supposed to be. Most of the neighbors complimented it. Brandon didn't. He wasn't openly hostile, but I could tell he wasn't happy. He walked along the fence line one afternoon, ran his hand across the cedar boards, and said, "Shame, really." I asked what he meant. He shrugged. "Kind of blocks the openness between the yards." I remember laughing. That's sort of the point of a privacy fence. He forced a smile, but it never reached his eyes. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. Over the next couple of years, there were little things. Small comments. Passive-aggressive jokes. If friends came over for a barbecue, Brandon somehow ended up mentioning the fence. If neighbors gathered outside, he'd bring up how much he missed the old view between the properties. Nothing serious enough to start an argument over. Just enough to make me wonder why he cared so much. Then came the Saturday morning that changed everything. It was late spring. The weather was perfect. Murphy and I had just finished our usual walk around the neighborhood. I came home, poured a cup of coffee, and headed into the backyard to enjoy the morning. That's when I saw the opening in the fence. For a second, I honestly thought somebody had broken in. My heart started racing. Then I noticed the patio furniture. 2 chairs, a small side table, a cooler. Everything carefully arranged on Brandon's side of the property and pointed directly through the gap in my fence toward the lake. Brandon himself was sitting there wearing sunglasses, feet stretched out, sipping something cold while staring at the water. It looked less like a neighbor enjoying his backyard and more like a man who had built himself front row seats to a show. I walked straight over. "Brandon, what exactly is this?" He glanced over the top of his sunglasses, completely calm. "Morning, Ryan. Why is my fence open?" He actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. The kind of laugh people make when they think you're overreacting. "Relax. We just wanted to enjoy the view." I stared at him. "By opening my fence?" He spread his hands like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "Come on. It's not like you own the lake." And standing there in my own backyard, looking at a man who had literally modified my fence so he could borrow my scenery, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple neighbor disagreement. It was the beginning of something much bigger, and unfortunately for Brandon, he had no idea how badly he'd miscalculated the person standing in front of him. The thing about people like Brandon is they count on one very specific reaction. They expect frustration. They expect yelling. They expect emotional decisions. What they don't expect is silence. So after he gave me that little speech about not owning the lake, I just looked at him for a few seconds, closed the fence panel, latched it, and walked back into my house without another word. The confused look on his face was almost funny. I think he expected an argument. Instead, I gave him nothing. For the rest of that day, I tried convincing myself it was a one-time incident. Maybe he'd had some bizarre lapse in judgment. Maybe Melissa would tell him how ridiculous it was. Maybe I'd wake up the next morning and we'd all pretend it never happened. But deep down, I already knew better. Some people don't test boundaries because they're confused about where the line is. They test boundaries because they're curious what happens if they cross it. A week later, I got my answer. It was a Saturday evening. I'd spent most of the day helping my brother move furniture across town and got home exhausted. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed several unfamiliar cars parked along the curb near Brandon's house. I didn't think much of it until I walked through my side gate and stepped into the backyard. Then I stopped. The fence was open again. Not only open, but transformed into something that looked like part of a backyard event venue. Brandon had strung decorative market lights through the opening, attaching them directly to my fence posts with plastic zip ties. A Bluetooth speaker hung from one of the cedar posts. There was a long table set up on his patio with half a dozen guests seated in a row facing directly toward the gap. And beyond that gap was the lake. My lake view, or at least the view he seemed convinced belonged to everyone except the person whose property he was using to access it. One of his guests actually waved at me. "Hey there," she called. "Beautiful evening." I remember standing there wondering if I had somehow entered an alternate universe where property lines no longer existed. Brandon noticed me and walked over carrying a plate of grilled chicken like we were about to discuss football scores. "Ryan," he said cheerfully. "Good timing. Want a burger?" I looked at the speaker attached to my fence. Then the lights. Then the opening. "You opened it again." He shrugged. Everybody wanted to enjoy the lake. Through my fence. It's just a fence. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes people become so unreasonable that your brain doesn't know how else to react. "No," I said quietly. "It's my fence." The smile disappeared from his face. Just for a second. Then it came back. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." That sentence stuck with me. Because every person who creates a problem eventually says the exact same thing. Somehow the person causing the issue becomes the victim of someone else's reaction. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten him. I simply took out my phone and started taking pictures. Every angle, every light, every attachment, every guest seated in front of the opening. Brandon's confidence faded a little with each photo. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Documenting." "Documenting what?" I looked directly at him. "You'll find out." That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing everything I collected. The photos, the videos, the survey documents from when the fence was installed, HOA approval records, contractor invoices, every piece of paperwork connected to that fence. Maybe it was the accountant in me, but I've always believed facts are stronger than emotions. If someone wants to fight, give them evidence instead. The next morning, I logged into the HOA portal and submitted a formal complaint. Not because I enjoy dealing with homeowners associations. Nobody enjoys dealing with homeowners associations. But they existed for situations exactly like this. I uploaded the survey, showing the fence entirely on my property. I included photographs showing Brandon opening the panel, attaching decorations, and modifying the structure without permission. Then I hit submit and waited. 48 hours later, I received a call from a property manager named Linda. Linda sounded like someone who had spent 20 years solving disputes between grown adults who should have known better. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I've reviewed your submission, and your documentation is very thorough." That sounded promising. She continued, "We've confirmed the fence is entirely within your property boundaries. Mr. Mercer has no access rights, no maintenance rights, and no easement privileges related to that structure. Meaning he has absolutely no legal authority to alter, access, open, modify, or attach anything to your fence." I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time all week. Linda wasn't finished. "We've opened a formal violation case." Now, some people would have stopped right there. The HOA was involved. The complaint had been validated. Brandon was going to receive a violation notice. Case closed. Except by that point, I had realized something important. Even if Brandon stopped touching the fence tomorrow, the real issue wasn't the fence anymore. The real issue was entitlement. Because people who genuinely respect boundaries don't repeatedly cross them after being told no. They cross them once, apologize, and move on. Brandon had crossed them twice, publicly, and somehow convinced himself he was the reasonable one. A few days later, I saw the violation letter arrive in his mailbox. The timing couldn't have been more perfect because I happened to be watering flowers in the front yard. Brandon stormed across his lawn holding the envelope. "Did you report me?" he demanded. I looked up from the hose. "Yep." His face turned red almost instantly. "You seriously filed an HOA complaint over a fence panel?" "No," I said. "I filed a complaint over someone modifying my property. We were looking at a lake. Through my fence. You don't own the lake." There was again. That same argument. That same justification. Like repeating it enough times would somehow make it relevant. I nodded slowly. "You're right." He looked surprised. "I don't own the lake." Then I pointed toward the fence. "But I own that." For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he muttered something under his breath and walked away. Watching him leave, I realized something else. The violation wasn't what bothered him. The fine wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was being told no. For years, he'd apparently gotten used to treating shared spaces, neighbors, and community rules as suggestions. Now someone had finally pushed back. Around that same time, I started talking with a local landscaping company. Not because I was angry anymore. Honestly, the anger had mostly faded. What remained was clarity. Every problem has a root cause. The root cause wasn't Brandon. The root cause was visibility. As long as that view existed, Brandon would continue finding ways to justify his behavior. So I scheduled a consultation. A week later, a contractor named Mike came out to inspect the property. We walked the fence line together. I explained the situation. Mike listened quietly, occasionally glancing toward Brandon's yard. Finally, he asked, "How much privacy are you looking for?" I looked across the property line, where Brandon's patio chairs still sat pointed directly toward the lake. Then I smiled. Enough that this conversation never has to happen again. Mike smiled back. "I think we can do that." And standing there beside the fence while measurements were taken and plans were drawn, I had no idea that Brandon was about to watch the very thing he'd obsessed over for years slowly disappear from sight, one panel and one tree at a time. The crew showed up on a Tuesday morning just after sunrise. I remember standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching 3 trucks back into my driveway, while Murphy sat beside the window, completely convinced he had been hired as site supervisor. The first thing they unloaded wasn't lumber or plants. It was steel. Long steel posts that looked far more serious than anything Brandon had probably imagined. By 8 o'clock, holes were being dug along the entire shared property line. By 9, concrete was being poured. By 10, Brandon was standing in his backyard pretending not to watch every single thing happening. If you've ever had a neighbor try very hard not to stare at something while obviously staring at it, you know exactly what I mean. Every few minutes I'd glance over and catch him peeking through the blinds or wandering outside with absolutely no purpose except gathering intelligence. Around lunchtime, he finally approached the fence line. "What's all this?" he asked. I took a sip of coffee. "Landscaping project." He looked past me at the steel framework taking shape. "Looks expensive." "Probably." "Seems excessive." I shrugged. "Depends on your perspective." The next few days were honestly some of the most satisfying days I've ever experienced as a homeowner. Slowly, piece by piece, a 12-foot privacy barrier began rising along the property line. It wasn't ugly. In fact, it looked fantastic. Clean lines. Professional installation. Completely HOA compliant. Every permit approved. Every measurement verified. There wasn't a single thing anyone could challenge. And then came the trees. Dozens of green giant arborvitae. 6 feet tall on the day, they were planted and destined to grow much larger over time. Mike walked me through the final layout while workers positioned each tree. "Give these a couple years," he said. "You'll have a wall of green." I looked toward Brandon's patio. "That's the idea." By the end of the week, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The open sight line that had once stretched all the way to the lake was now interrupted by a solid wall of privacy and greenery. You could still catch tiny glimpses through certain angles, but the days of sitting in a chair and enjoying an unobstructed view were over. Completely over. The funny part was that I wasn't even thinking about revenge anymore. I genuinely loved the finished project. It made my backyard feel peaceful, private, protected. It felt like my property again. A few days later, the HOA made its final decision. Brandon received an official violation notice. The letter required him to pay a fine, remove every unauthorized attachment from my fence, and submit a written acknowledgement confirming that the structure belonged entirely to me. When I heard about that last part, I almost laughed out loud. The fine probably annoyed him. The acknowledgement probably humiliated him. A grown man being forced to sign paperwork admitting he had no ownership rights over something he'd been treating like community property. That's the kind of lesson nobody enjoys learning. The real cinematic moment happened the following Saturday. I was sitting on my back patio, reading when I noticed movement next door. Brandon was outside alone. No guests, no music, no drinks, no confidence. Just Brandon with a pair of wire cutters and a ladder. For nearly 2 hours, I watched him remove everything he'd attached to my fence. The market lights came down first, then the zip ties, then the speaker. Piece by piece, he dismantled the little viewing area he'd created. What made the scene unforgettable wasn't what he was removing. It was what stood behind him while he worked. The new privacy barrier. The young arborvitae lined up like green soldiers. The structure that existed because he couldn't leave well enough alone. At one point, he climbed down the ladder and simply stood there looking toward where the lake used to be visible. Except now, there was nothing to see. No sparkling water. No sunset reflection. No votive scenery. Just privacy. Legal, professionally installed privacy. I don't know what he was thinking in that moment. Maybe he blamed me. Maybe he blamed the HOA. Maybe, for the first time, he blamed himself. What I do know is that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are surprisingly permanent. Over the next year, life settled down. The conflict disappeared almost completely. Brandon stopped making comments. He stopped lingering near the property line. We weren't friends, but we became something better than enemies. We became strangers who minded our own business. The trees grew quickly. Every season they became taller, thicker, and denser. By the following summer, they had transformed from landscaping into a living wall. Occasionally, I'd see Brandon's patio furniture still sitting in the same place. The chairs remained pointed toward the exact spot where the lake had once been visible. Every time I noticed them, I had to fight the urge to laugh. It was like watching someone leave binoculars pointed at a brick wall. And here's the part that still amazes me. None of this needed to happen. If Brandon had simply respected the fence the first time I asked, he probably would have enjoyed partial views of the lake for years. If he treated my property like my property instead of a public resource, nothing would have changed. But entitlement has a strange way of creating the very outcome people are trying to avoid. He wanted more access, and he ended up with none. He wanted a better view, and he lost the view entirely. He wanted control over something that didn't belong to him, And in the process, he created a situation where every reminder of that mistake now stands 12 feet tall and keeps growing. Even today, when I sit outside in the evening and listen to the wind moving through those trees, I sometimes think back to the day he told me, "You don't own the lake." And honestly, he was right. I never owned the lake, but I absolutely owned the fence. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by building the privacy screen and planting the trees, or was it a fair response after repeated boundary violations? If you were in my position, would you have given Brandon one more chance, or would you have handled it even sooner? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those neighbor disputes where people are going to be divided right down the middle.